trekked alone before, spent more nights than I could count under stars without a soul nearby. Solitude was my balm, the quiet of the woods my retreat. But this forest, there was something wrong about it. Even as I set up camp, a sliver of unease nestled into my gut like a splinter. I couldn't quite explain it, but there was a heaviness to the air, a feeling that something was watching, something that didn't belong. The first sign was a tree. No, not just any tree. This one was scarred. Deep grooves clawed into the bark, like something had raked its fingers down its side in a fit of rage. I bent down, touching the raw wood, feeling the splinters, fresh enough that they still bled sap. Bear, maybe, but what kind of bear claws like that? The next sign was worse, a trail of broken bones, strewn in a line that led into the deeper woods, half buried in the damp earth. Not clean bones either. These were splintered, twisted as if they'd been gnawed and then spat out in contempt. Some still had bits of flesh clinging to them, dried and shriveled like twisted jerky. The smell was thick, rotten, so strong that even the crisp air couldn't mask it. That night, as I set up my tent, a scream echoed through the forest. It wasn't human, not quite. A high-pitched shriek, layered with something deeper, something that scraped against the inside of my skull. I froze, my hand halfway to the zipper of my tent. The sound seemed to claw at the night, desperate and angry, but somehow filled with hunger. It's just some animal, I told myself, though even as I thought it, I could feel my skin prickling with unease. But I'd come too far to turn back just because of some weird noises. I zipped myself in, lay down, and willed sleep to come. It didn't. Every rustle outside, every creak of a branch set my nerves on edge. I must have drifted off at some point because when I opened my eyes, dawn was breaking, casting faint light through the forest canopy. Shaken and exhausted, I packed up camp, the eerie stillness pressing in on me. As I started to walk, I tried to shake the feeling that something was watching, but the silence followed me, unnatural and thick, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it. A campsite lay ahead, partially hidden by a thicket. Relief washed over me. Other people. I'm not alone out here. But as I approached, that relief curdled into something cold, heavy, and sour. The tents were shredded, torn, as if they'd been mauled by a pack of rabid wolves. Gear lay scattered, crushed and broken, like toys in the hands of an angry child. And the bodies, God, the bodies. There were 3 of them, sprawled across the clearing, in broken, unnatural positions, limbs twisted at grotesque angles. One had his head nearly severed, the neck nothing but a ragged mess of torn sinew and bone. Another, I couldn't even tell if it had been a man or a woman. The face was mangled beyond recognition, eyes gouged out, skin slashed to ribbons. Blood pooled around them, soaked into the earth, painting the ground in patches of dark crimson. And the last one, she was sprawled out, her eyes wide open, staring into the sky. Her mouth was frozen in a silent scream, lips curled back to expose teeth stained with blood, not hers. In her hand, she clutched a shard of metal, like she'd tried to fight, even as the life drained from her. Her torso had been torn open, ribs cracked and splayed like the twisted branches above. Something had fed on her, gnawed through flesh and muscle, tearing down to the bone. I stumbled back, nausea bubbling up, choking me. I couldn't take my eyes off them, couldn't shake the feeling that any second now, One of them might sit up, those hollow eyes staring right into me, seeing me as the next meal. The woods around me suddenly felt smaller, closing in, each shadow stretching towards me like greedy fingers. There was a sound then, faint, like the rustling of leaves, but slower, more deliberate. I turned, squinting into the trees, but saw nothing. Just the dense green, the skeletal branches, and that endless silence. My skin prickled, the sensation of eyes boring into me, lurking just beyond the edge of my sight. "Leave," a voice whispered in my mind, the instinct clawing at me, screaming at me to run. I backed away, my heartbeat thundering in my ears, drowning out every other sound. I turned and bolted. The image of those ravaged bodies burned into my memory, each step pounding out a mantra of go, go, go. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following, that the shadows themselves had taken on a life of their own, hungry and patient, waiting for me to slip. That night, as I set up camp far from the clearing, I sat awake, listening to the silence, the same dread sinking into my bones. I knew I wasn't alone out here. I packed up at dawn, hands shaking as I fumbled with the gear. Every breath I took felt thick, like I was inhaling fear itself, something primal, something that ran colder and sharper than I'd ever known. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the mangled faces from the camp, their wide, vacant eyes staring, blaming me for living. I didn't bother with breakfast. I needed to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as I could. But no matter how far I went, the forest seemed unchanged, as if I were walking in circles. I'd mark trees only to find similar scratches in different places, like the forest was taunting me, shifting around me as I moved. Each rustle of leaves made my skin crawl, and every time the wind blew, carrying with it a hint of that rancid, decaying stench, I felt my stomach twist with dread. Then I heard it, a soft, barely there shuffle behind me. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped too, mirroring me, mimicking my every move. I looked over my shoulder, but all I saw were shadows, thick and twisted, weaving through the trees. They seemed darker than they should have been, like the sun didn't reach there, swallowed up by some ancient, malevolent darkness. I quickened my pace, each step faster, my breathing shallow, my heartbeat drumming a frantic rhythm in my chest. The shadows seemed to keep pace, lingering just out of reach, slithering between the trees, close enough that I could feel their presence like an icy touch on the back of my neck. Suddenly, the smell hit me, a wave of decay so thick it nearly knocked me off my feet. I gagged, clamping a hand over my mouth as bile rose in my throat, and then I saw it, just a few feet ahead, another campsite, or what was left of it. This one was worse than the last. The ground was littered with scraps of flesh and torn clothing, bits of bone poking up from the earth like pale, ghastly fingers clawing their way out of the soil. Blood painted the trees in thick, blackened streaks, like someone had smeared it with their hands, marking the forest as their territory. One tent was still mostly intact, its canvas flapping in the breeze, revealing something inside. A hand, or what was left of one, half-eaten, the fingers twisted into a final, desperate curl. I couldn't look away. It felt like staring into a nightmare I couldn't escape from, a horror that clawed its way into my mind, leaving me hollow and shaking. I turned, stumbling backward, desperate to put distance between me and the blood-soaked scene. But then I heard it, a faint, guttural whisper echoing through the trees. The language was foreign, harsh, like rocks grinding together, yet somehow sentient, aware. It was like they were laughing, taunting me, knowing I was helpless, that I was nothing more than prey. I took off running, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, catching glimpses of them, pale figures gliding between the trees, their bodies emaciated, skeletal, as if they'd been starved for centuries. Their eyes glowed with a sickly yellow hunger, the same hunger that had carved those bodies to pieces. Their mouths hung open, jaws stretching too wide, filled with rows of needle-like teeth, as if grinning in grotesque satisfaction. I pushed myself harder, legs screaming as I tried to outrun them, but they were always there, silent and relentless, slipping in and out of view, the shadows their ally. I tripped, my foot catching on a root, and crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the air out of me. I scrambled to get up, but a sound stopped me cold, a slow, dragging scrape behind me. I turned my head, every nerve screaming in protest, and saw one of them standing at the edge of the trees watching me. It was tall, its limbs impossibly thin, stretched and elongated like some grotesque puppet. Its face was a mockery of humanity, hollow cheeks, skin stretched tight over sharp bones, and eyes that burned with an intensity that felt like they were searing into my soul. Its lips peeled back in a snarl, revealing those awful teeth, and it took a step toward me, its movements fluid, almost graceful, as if it were savoring the chase. I pushed myself to my feet, pain ripping through my shoulder where I'd landed hard. Blood trickled down my arm, leaving a trail that I knew they would follow, that they wanted to follow. I could feel their hunger, a sick, ravenous thing that clawed at the air, a hunger that wanted to consume me, to tear me apart piece by piece. I stumbled forward, my vision blurring with tears of terror and exhaustion. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I just needed to move, to stay ahead of them. But their footsteps, soft, shuffling, almost polite, followed, as if they had all the time in the world. And then, out of nowhere, a shape materialized in front of me, a Wendigo stepping into my path, its eyes burning like twin flames in the dark. It lifted a skeletal hand, long fingers curling like talons, and I realized it was reaching for me. I slashed out with the only weapon I had left, a jagged piece of metal I'd grabbed in my panicked flight, sharp enough to do some damage if I was lucky. The blade connected, slicing through the creature's flesh, but it didn't react. It just stared at me, those eyes filled with a dark amusement, as if it was letting me fight, letting me struggle, before it would finally devour me. I ran, not looking back this time, not daring to see them closing in. The forest blurred around me, shadows stretching, twisting, each one hiding another of those things, another mouth ready to tear me apart. The whispers followed, a low, rumbling chorus, voices layered and warped, saying things I couldn't understand, but that felt like promises of pain and death. I knew then that there was no escape, not really. They were toying with me, letting me run, letting me think I had a chance. But it was a game to them, a hunt they had perfected over centuries, an art of fear and hunger that had no end, and I was their prey. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stumbled through the dark, dense forest. Every step felt heavier, like the earth itself was pulling me back. The Wendigos were close, closer than they'd been all night, their guttural whispers tangled in the air surrounding me, echoing in a language that wasn't meant for human ears. The trees, once my shield, now loomed like prison bars. My legs burned, my body screaming at me to stop, but I didn't dare. Stopping meant death, or worse. When the ground suddenly gave way beneath me, I hit the earth hard, my shoulder exploding in pain as I rolled into a small, uneven clearing. Above me, the faint silver light of the moon barely filtered through the twisted canopy. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the crude spear I'd fashioned earlier, knowing it was little more than a glorified stick. Blood dripped from my palm where I'd gripped it too tightly, the jagged splinters cutting deep into my flesh. A guttural growl broke the silence, and I froze. They were here, 5 of them. Their gaunt forms slithered into view, one by one, their twisted antlers catching the moonlight. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness, locking onto me with a hunger that made my insides feel like ice. I raised the spear, trembling. "Stay back." My voice cracked, weak even to my own ears. The Wendigos didn't react. They didn't need to. This wasn't a fight. It was a hunt, and I was the prey. The largest of the group stepped forward, its skeletal frame clicking with each movement. Its body stretched unnaturally tall, every limb an affront to nature, every motion deliberate, as though savoring the fear radiating from me. Its head tilted slightly. The hollow sockets where eyes should be seemed to glimmer with cruel amusement. Its maw opened, revealing rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth, and it released a sound I could only describe as laughter, a guttural, broken sound that made bile rise in my throat. I lunged. The spear sank into its chest with a sickening crack. For one fleeting moment, hope flickered. Then the creature looked down, almost curious, at the shaft protruding from its ribcage. With an effortless motion, it yanked the spear free and snapped it in half like a twig. My heart sank. I turned to run, but another Wendigo was already there, its skeletal hand closing around my shoulder. Its claws dug into my flesh, and I screamed, the pain blinding as it threw me backward like a rag doll. I landed hard, the wind knocked from my lungs. The 5 closed in, their glowing eyes burning into me. One leaned down, its rancid breath washing over me as it sniffed the air around my face, as though savoring the moment before the kill. I clawed at the ground, desperate, but there was nowhere to go. The forest had become a cage, and I was trapped. As its clawed hand descended toward me, time seemed to slow. I thought of the mangled bodies I'd found, the campers reduced to nothing more than blood and bone. I realized this was how it ended, not with a fight, not with survival, but as another story, another warning whispered around campfires. The Wendigo gripped my neck, its claws biting into my skin, and lifted me off the ground. The others circled, their guttural whispers growing louder, their hollow mouths opening in anticipation. The leader leaned closer, its antlers scraping against a branch above, and for a moment, I swore I saw something human in its dead, glowing eyes, a flicker of recognition, of mockery. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out, just silence. When the dawn broke, the forest was quiet. The clearing was empty, save for the faint indentations in the earth where I had fallen, and a trail of blood leading deeper into the woods. The birds did not sing, the wind did not blow. Somewhere, deep in the forest, the Wendigos waited, their hunger unending, their hunt eternal. And I I was gone. Or maybe I had become something else entirely.